Dr. Rajan, thank you very much for speaking to PTI. Let me start by asking you about global economy. It's two shades. Some economies are growing, some economies are recovering. US is still uncertain. China, there's a lot of question marks asked. What's your reading of the global economy, and where do you see India in that entire picture?
Well, I think there are bright spots. I think certainly the US is one very bright spot. It's been growing, many would say above potential for the last few years. And it's still, if you look at the latest readings of the Atlanta Fed, the estimate for this quarter is 3% growth. That's spectacular. That's much higher than growth, potential would be. Part of it is because, the U.S. has experienced a lot of immigration in the last few years, which has enabled the labor force to grow. Also, part of it is participation rates have increased. More people are working than used to earlier. And interestingly, productivity has also been strong. So the U.S. is a spectacular phenomenon at this point. Even despite all the strong growth, you're seeing inflation coming down. So that's why the hope of a soft landing. Now, what you're seeing is the labor market is slowing. And, we still can't be perfectly confident there will be a soft landing. But at least it's doing well so far. I think, other bright spots, of course, India is a bright spot in the sense that 7% growth is very strong. And China is, in fact, the weak spot because Chinese growth has not picked up. China depends a lot on consumption growth. And the Chinese consumer doesn't want to spend, especially given their biggest source of wealth, housing, is not really strong. And given the uncertainties about growth, jobs, youth unemployment is high. But they're coming up with more packages. We'll see if anything sticks. But really, what they have to fix is the housing market. Last place is Europe in this. And Europe is starting to pick up a little more. But really, the big question mark around Europe is what is going to be its sustainable source of growth. That's why the Draghi report, which came out recently, is trying to say we need to improve productivity, we need to have stronger technological progress, etc. But it's work in progress. So mixed bag across the world.
We're just a few weeks away from the U.S. elections, and it's Trump versus Kamala Harris. What does it mean for the world economy? And who is better for the if the Indian economy is to be considered?
Well, I think you want to look at their policies, their stated policies. Now, keep in mind that stated policies may not be actual policies, but you have to take them at their word. I think from that perspective, for the global economy, big change is going to be problematic. And the Trump administration of the future promises big change on, trade, tariffs, on immigration, on taxation. Now, taxation we could debate for a long time whether it's good or bad. I mean, the U.S. has a fiscal deficit which is 6 to 7% of GDP, and the Trump administration promises even more deficits. That said, the way they want to make up the difference is by erecting tariffs. And, they say making the foreigner pay, but in fact it will be the U.S. consumer who typically ends up paying for higher tariffs. But higher tariffs are going to be problematic for the world because, as we just said, China is already growing quite slowly. A lot of the tariffs will be imposed on China. 60% tariffs are being talked about. And also they're going to try and stop the transshipments from China. Now, the belief from other parts of the world is, we will benefit. But remember, the Trump policy makers are against any kind of deficit. It's not just the Chinese deficit. They want the U.S. to bring more jobs inside. So they don't want to support imports. And so there's an across-the-board tariff which is being proposed, but also from India's perspective, something to worry about, reciprocal tariffs. What you charge our goods, we'll charge your goods. So it's not going to be an easy ride for other countries if the tariff regime changes considerably. Second big issue is immigration. As you know, there's been a lot of immigration into the U.S. from across the world. they're going to re-examine all that. Not just what is called undocumented immigration, that is the people crossing without papers, but also, H-1Bs, this, that, all that will be re-looked at. So that's another place where I think India will have some concerns. Now, with the Harris administration, the belief is that it'll be more of the same as the Biden administration. So the change there may be less. Of course, there are plans to do more spending, for example, child tax credits and a middle-class tax cut relative to what might otherwise happen. But these are more status quo-like than what the Trump administration promises. I worry more for the global economy from the big change rather than status quo.
So is a big change bad for the Indian economy as well? As you said, you worry about the global economy, about the big change?
Well, there are some pluses, but there are also minuses. Pluses, yes, everybody's saying, well, if the US stops buying from China, it has to buy from somewhere else. Typically, it's not going to be from the US itself because some of these goods are produced in low-cost labor countries. So it will move, and whether it moves to Vietnam, Bangladesh, or India, some of these countries will benefit. That's sort of the sense of the positive change. The negative change, however, also has to be thought about. That, as I said, these are people who don't like deficits. And, the deficit with respect to India will be looked at very closely, and there could be reciprocal tariffs imposed on India. I think Trump has already said some things about India and that he wants to fix things. That may not be pleasant. But there's also the issue of immigration. A lot of our people get H-1B visas, etc. We have a lot of students going into the US. And as you know, a number of countries have now erected barriers against foreign students. There are people in the US looking at the protests that are happening in the universities who are saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have so many foreign students because they, want to have a different voice. So I think these are issues that come more to the fore and may be worrisome for India. Again, we have to see what happens. But in terms of promises, I think these are some things that we have to consider.
As we speak, we are marking the 10 years of Make in India. What, in your assessment, has been the success or not so successful part of Make in India, and what more needs to be done to promote manufacturing in the country?
I think focusing attention on the need to produce more in India, whether it's goods or services, I think it's a good thing. I think it's important to do this the right way. That is, to do it by improving the ability of Indians to produce, more capacity amongst the workforce, skilling, training, more ease of doing business for business people, that is, more certainty about government policy, less fear of raids by the inspector or the tax authorities, etc. That's a package which creates the environment where growth happens. And I think if we focus on that, I think that would strengthen, the concept of Make in India. And I think, some of that was being done and is being done, but we need to keep assessing, is this the right thing? So when we say doing business, should we follow the World Bank doing business and check off, ye kiya, wo kiya, we've done this? Or should we actually ask the business person, what are your big difficulties? And, try and rectify those and keep surveying them to see whether in reality they find things have improved. Ultimately, the proof of the pudding is you're growing your manufacturing sector, you're growing your services sector. If that is not happening in the right way, then you have to ask, what am I not doing? So I would say the intention is good. I think in some areas we've done a lot. As I said, infrastructure, we've done a lot. That's been very useful. But we need to check the other places. And the best way to check is to ask critics, what do you think? What has happened? Has it happened the way you wanted? Should we do more? And you get feedback, and then you work along with it.
So are we not asking the critics enough?
I don't think we are. I think, this is more general, not about the Make in India. I think we want praise. We love everybody who comes to praise us, which is a good thing. But of course, then people understand that if they're more critical, they probably will not get heard. So you hear only one side of it. And what you really need to ask is, okay, what are we not doing right? Fine, praising us for what we're doing right is okay, but that doesn't help us improve. Telling us what we're doing wrong will get us to focus on that. And that means both domestic critics, but also international critics. We need to hear from both and not dismiss all the criticism that we hear as, acha, these guys have an axe to grind, or there's some vested interest, or there's some hidden hand. But all the guys who praise, no, these guys know what India truly is. You can't take it, you need to take both.
So 7% growth, is that enough for India to achieve the third largest economic status in this decade and becoming the developed nation by 2040? Is that enough for India to achieve those targets?
So I think separate these. In terms of becoming the third largest economy, of course, if we grow at 7%, no mishaps. Germany is at about 4.5, so is Japan, 4.5 trillion. India is 3.7. If you do the math, it's 2-3 years, we'll be past them. That is not something which is out of the realm of possibility. It will happen. What is more worrisome, however, is when we say developed nation. Now, what does it mean to be developed? Now, that is also a changing metric, right? Let us say being developed is, having a per capita GDP in today's dollars of about 15,000. If you see that, then you put a 7% growth rate and you find it's not enough to become a 15,000 per capita GDP by 2047. We need to do better. So, but the other aspect you need to think about is, where are we going to generate that growth? What is the vision for that growth? What you're finding is, we just talked about the Trump administration. The pathways which rely on trade, especially of manufacturing goods, is becoming harder. That the world is shutting down on them. Everybody wants their own manufacturing and doesn't want to cede it to others. You can see now for EVs, Chinese EVs, 100% tariffs in the US, 100% in Canada. Europe has only put 38, 37%. But if all the EVs are going to Europe, they will put tariffs up. And similarly for the developing countries and emerging markets. So the reality is, there isn't a lot of place for a China-sized country to grow that way. So how are we going to grow? We need to think about what that vision is. There's no point keeping on saying 2047, Viksit Desh, Viksit Desh. What is the plan to get there? Now, we will hopefully have a vision document very soon. We need to debate that vision document. Does this make sense? Are all these things going to work as intended? And I think the constant effort has to be, here's what we intend to do it, and measure. Did this achieve what we were trying to do? If not, why not? So that's where the fact that we're a democracy helps, because we get a whole lot of criticism. This is not the Soviet Union. This is not China. We get people commenting back, you didn't do this right, you didn't do that right. And that helps us change, which is very good.
So after 10 years, we are back to coalition politics. We don't have a single party commanding majority in the parliament, in Lok Sabha. So does that reduce the appetite for the government to do reforms, especially big ticket reforms like privatization? Has that appetite gone, or do you see Modi 3.0 also carrying the legacy of reforms in an aggressive way?
Well, I don't think it should necessarily stop reforms. I think it may make, may force more consensus behind the reforms, which requires more agile government, more sensitive, clever government to do that. Think of some of our most reformist governments. The Narasimha Rao government wasn't a supermajority. They had, a majority, but it was clubbed together with a bunch of parties supporting, right? And, the dream budget, Mr. Chidambaram's dream budget, was done in a coalition government. So it's not that coalition governments have meant no reform. I think that even NDA 1 was not a supermajority on BJP's side either. So I think we've had a lot of good economics-focused governments, and there's no reason why we can't do that even under the current regime.
So what, in your opinion, should be the reforms that Modi 3.0 should take in from 24 to 29?
Well, I think the single biggest is a laser focus on education. Now, immediately people say, no, that's not a central subject, it's concurrent, this, that. But, from the country's perspective, we absolutely need a better skill base, a better education base, right? Because what's confronting us? What's confronting us is the fact that very soon we're going to have AI in a big way. Are our youth going to be able to, meet that challenge and go ahead? And for that, they have to be creative in their own right. They have certainly, even if you want just manufacturing jobs, you need a strong skill base, because the kind of manufacturing jobs today are not the old sort of low-skilled manufacturing. Even the basic manufacturing jobs require some use of capital, some use of machines, some numeracy, some literacy. So I think we absolutely need more of a focus on getting good education. Not mass education, good quality mass education. Just getting everybody in school, we did that. But now we see a lot of them are dropping out because they're not learning enough. We need to keep them in school, not forcibly, but by making it attractive to stay, because they will learn. And so we need to ask ourselves, because, we keep saying Viksit Desh, okay, so 2047, we are in 2024, 23 years from now. The child who's born today will be entering the labor force there. What have we done to ensure that child who's born today will be a developed country child? That starts today. That doesn't start in 2047. And for that, nutrition has to be strong. We have 35% malnutrition. That doesn't work in 2047. We need better primary education. We need the child to learn how to read and write. We need better secondary education. We need top quality universities. We don't have one university in the top 100. This sounds negative. No, it's saying that we have a challenge. We can meet that challenge. Just see what we did in chess. This is the most highly intellectual activity, supposedly, and we won both the men's and the women's. We can do it, but we need to give our people a chance, which means we need to focus on what the government has to do to bridge the gap. Now, government doesn't have to run the universities. Government doesn't have to run the school. But it has to make sure that in Jharkhand, those students there have as much of a chance as the students in Delhi. And just lifting up the quality everywhere. And that's where the center plays a role, because not all the states have the same capacity. Of course, there's the central universities and all that. Let's upgrade some of them to be really world-class, because ultimately the fight beyond this is going to be about who has the best intellectual property. And Indians are capable, but we need the institutions who match the capabilities of the Indians.
Dr. Rajan, Fed recently cut interest rates by 50 basis points, larger than what was expected. Is it a cue for other central banks to also follow suit? RBI policy is just a week away from now. Do you think RBI will also take a cue from that? Is that what the other central banks should also be following?
So I don't know what RBI will do, and I won't try and project what they will do. I can talk more generally about central banks, which is that, yes, the Fed cut has given them more room to proceed at a pace that they think appropriate. If the Fed hadn't cut, there would be a sense that, oh, the Fed is keeping rates high, we have no room to moderate our policies. I think the Fed has created more room for others to perhaps reduce interest rates. And so in that sense, people will be looking at their policies. That said, there are reasons why the US is different from other countries right now. As I said, it's got both the combination of high growth, but also high capacity because of the immigration, because of the productivity, because of the greater labor force participation. So what works for the US may not work for the rest of the world. Each country will have to look at its own situation.
So for MPC to consider a rate cut, is it the right time, or you think it will have to wait more?
Well, I have a rule of not commenting on RBI policy. Let me not start.
So going back to the Indian economy, what in your assessment are the positives that are going for the Indian economy, and what are the potential headwinds that it might face? And what is your medium-term growth outlook, both GDP as well as for inflation?
Right. So I think the positives definitely over the last few years have been the infrastructure build-out, which has improved logistics in the country quite a bit. And I think that's positive. It's also created jobs. You see, jobs in construction have been going up. That's a good thing because we really need jobs. I think in terms of growth, predicting to the last decimal point what's next, I think we're at the 6 to 7 range, and that's decent. What I worried more about was consumption growth from the lower half, which was still tepid. Just as an example, two-wheeler sales hadn't recovered to the pre-pandemic high. 2018 or 2019 was the high. It hasn't come back. I think it's picking up now, but I think on the flip side, we see passenger car sales coming down. So, there is an issue of consumption demand, and to really get strong consumption demand, it's not just asset prices, but there has to be a strong sense that you have a good job and there's improvement on the way. And I think it differs for Indians. Some Indians, especially at the upper level, are comfortable and have high incomes. It's going well. At the lower level, I think the desperate need is for jobs. And you can see this, forget the official statistics, you can see it in the number of applications for government jobs, which are overwhelming. So I think we need to focus on that job creation. I'm glad the recent budget has a number of measures to, connect people to the jobs via apprenticeships, etc. But we have to monitor that very closely, see what works, and expand what works much more. The big worry is we're doing only little. And remember, this is the time we get our population dividend. A lot of young people entering the labor force, if they're discouraged, Indian participation levels, that is people who are of working age and are actually looking for a job or in a job, is abysmal. Not just for women, but also for men. And we need to increase that. And the way you increase that is partly by training people so that they have more confidence they can get a job, but also encouraging industry. One of the worries I have is our labor-intensive industries are not doing that well. If you look at textiles, Bangladesh is surging, Vietnam is surging, Bangladesh except for the recent turmoil. But we are not doing as well. So we need to look at these labor-intensive industries and see what are we missing, what should we do in order to increase the pace of growth.
So where are we missing the bus then? Are we not creating enough jobs? Is 7% GDP growth not creating enough jobs for the new youth who are coming to the market?
That's the unfortunate part, right? You would think with 7% growth we'd be creating a lot of jobs. But we're actually, if you look at our manufacturing growth, it is more capital intensive. It's the industries that are more capital intensive which are growing faster. Say big steel mills, aluminum mills. That requires a lot of capital. But that leather factory or the textile factory, those aren't growing. That's where the jobs are plentiful. So we need to understand why that is not happening. Why? And it may be a mix of training needs, but it also may be a mix of trying to do some free trade agreements with big areas so that we have easier access. Especially for labor-intensive stuff, we are competing with Africa, we're competing with East Asia, many of whom are part of larger trade agreements. So I think we need to look at all this very, very carefully. We cannot be left out, and more important, we cannot lose the population dividend. We have a short span, 15 years maybe.
So far, the government has been doing the heavy lifting as far as the capex is concerned. The budget has made a record capital expenditure outlay has given, but the private sector seems to be still lagging. What is the reason behind that, and what needs to be done to propel private sector to come into play?
It is a little bit of a mystery. I agree. I think that certainly in the areas where the government has made a lot of investment, especially infrastructure, that has created a lot of demand for steel, aluminum, cement, and so on. So presumably there's some investment going on there. But the bigger issue is the broader investment that is required. Now, hopefully part of the answer is we're trying to become more productive with the existing capital that we have. When you look at capital utilization, it's about 75 when I last looked at the numbers. So it's not that we are overusing existing capital. It seems as if demand hasn't crept up to the point where they feel they need to make all that kind of investment. Now, we've been waiting. I think the finance minister has also, to some extent, scolded industry for not investing. But they're going to invest if they see profits. And for them to see profits, they have to see strong growth in consumption demand. And I think what they're basically saying is, until we see that, we're not going to put more assets in the ground. Now, there's a little bit of chicken and egg, because unless they start putting more investments in, they're not creating as many jobs. If people don't have so many jobs, they're not going to be consuming so strongly. And so you sort of don't grow as strongly as you could. So I do think we need to sort of ask why, and not just say that they're not interested in investing. What are the constraints that are keeping them? And maybe try and address them. I mean, some have suggested, we need rules to be a little clearer for longer period of time. That's been an old problem with India, that we need to set the rule structure for a few years rather than keep changing them. Another is, taxation. Well, taxes have been brought down for corporations, so that can't be the main reason. There has to be something else. But I would ask industrialists seriously, what is hampering investment? To my mind, the one big thing is capacity utilization. It's not that high yet to the point where they feel they must invest, and they're being very cautious about it, keeping in mind that they don't see demand growing that strongly. So we have to ask, well, do we need to grow demand more strongly to get this? It's a question. It's a real question.
GST is now into its 8th year. There have been talks of rate rationalization. Do you think the time has come now, time is right for a restructure of GST, bringing down 5 rates to 3, possibly 3, or maybe to some kind of rejig? Is that what is needed to boost consumption in the country right now?
I wouldn't put low consumption to GST, as the prime factor. I think after a policy has run for a fair amount of time, it's useful to ask, okay, what has been the experience? Do we need policy change? But I wouldn't do it based on, sort of just action and reaction. I would, try and appoint an expert committee to go into it, to take the opinions, just like the Finance Commission does, take the opinions of the various stakeholders, including the states, and come up with something that meets, broadly the needs of the country. So I would think that something more deliberate than, we need 3 or we need 5 or we need to bring alcohol or not. I mean, that kind of, I wouldn't do a knee-jerk policy here. I would have a committee go into it seriously and think through it rather than make it and given that it needs the approval of the various states, you can't make it a political thing. It has to be on sound economics, but addressing the concerns of the different parties.
You mentioned about Finance Commission, and there is a thought of some kind of a discrimination that the southern states face because of low population growth versus the taxes that they pay, versus the industrialization, versus the northern states. Without taking any names, they have grown much faster in terms of population, but in terms of GDP growth, industrial growth, much slower than what the southern state or western states have done. Is that criticism fair, and how do you weigh that for the Finance Commission to look at?
Well, the Finance Commission has always been about the appropriate sort of allocation of taxes between the center and the state and amongst the states, right? So certainly it's an appropriate theme for the Finance Commission to take up. I think that on this issue, there is the issue of equalization, and there's the issue of equity. Equalization, yes. What we do want is the states in India to have, where there is little opportunity, you want to bring more opportunity because it's good if India grows together. In fact, it prevents this kind of conflict. But it's good for India if every part of India grows strongly. There's the equity issue, which is that the states that are growing faster have also in the process, typically as you grow wealthier, as my Korean friend used to say, wealth is the greatest contraceptive. So as you grow wealthier, you tend to have fewer kids. And that's what's happening in the West and in the southern states. But of course, what they feel is that they penalize two ways. One is they have to hand over more of their revenues to help some of the states who are falling behind. But plus, on the political front, they may lose seats if there's a delimitation because, the more populous states will get more seats. I think we need to bridge this gap. I think definitely there have to be some transfers from the richer states to the poorer states, but there has to be some sense that, there is a compensation for that. What form that would take, I think it's worth having a dialogue about, right? One is the sheer compensation which comes from growing that part faster and seeing demand for your goods. I mean, they're not going to sit in isolation. They're going to buy more of the richer states' goods. So there is some partial compensation for that. But is there a way, for example, that delimitation can be done in a more sort of respectful of the concerns of different parts of the country? Ultimately, we want a fair democracy, one man, one woman, one vote. But we also want to make sure that it doesn't happen by jhatka. It happens in a smooth way and, in a way that is commensurate in the longer run with India's growth. So I think that, more deliberation is needed and more thought into how this change is going to happen. But it's certainly something the Finance Commission should be thinking about because as Arvind Subramaniam has put it, we're not getting the kind of convergence we want. Ultimately, all these problems are solved by everybody growing at the same rate, but we're not getting the poorer states to grow faster, and the gap sometimes is widening. We need to figure out how we remedy that.
Sir, this year's economic survey has pitched for an inflation targeting framework that targets an inflation rate excluding food. So what is your view on this, sir?
See, when I came into office, we were still targeting PPI, Producer Price Index. Now, that has no bearing to what the average consumer faces. So, when the RBI says inflation is low, PPI ko dekho, but if the consumer is facing something very different, then they don't really believe that inflation is down. So, I think it's best that inflation target a basket, which is what the consumer consumes. Now remember, why is that important? Because that affects the consumer's perception of inflation. And ultimately, inflationary expectations, that's a technical word for saying what they believe inflation will be in the future, determines inflation. So if you leave out some of the most important parts of inflation and tell them, inflation is under control, but food prices are going through the roof or, something else is going which is not included in the inflation basket, then, they don't have great faith in the Reserve Bank. So really, I think to have effect, it should be as close to what consumers consume. Now, the argument against including food is, you can't affect it. You can't affect food prices in the short run. But yeah, if food prices stay high for a long time, that does imply there are constraints on producing food relative to the demand, which means to balance that, you have to bring down inflation in other areas, which is what the central bank can do. It can target the aggregate price level. So I don't think it's a sufficient argument to say you can't control food prices. And I do think the important part of the argument for including it is you typically want the overall basket that the consumer sort of consumes to be what is counted as inflation. Otherwise, it becomes, they get separated, and then the RBI is no longer as credible as it could be.
Sir, recently the UPSC withdrew its advertisement seeking lateral entry into the bureaucracy. So what is your views on the lateral entry and controversy surrounding it?
Well, this is a controversy I don't want to jump into. Look, I think good talent, fresh blood in government is always a good thing. I think it has to respect the sort of incentives of the people already in. You can't sort of upset them by saying, we're going to close out all promotions for you by bringing people from outside. But similarly, I think you have to respect the kinds of affirmative action, etc., that the government is doing. So this can't be a backdoor way to bypass all that. At the same time, you must recognize this is the way to bring talent in. So you look for talent as widely as you can, respecting some of the norms that the government has built up. So I'm not against lateral entry. I did some of it myself when I was in the RBI. But it's hard, it has to be managed, and it requires some consensus building so that, you don't anger too many people in the process.
Sir, recently the Union Cabinet accepted one nation, one election proposal. So are you in favor of this proposal, sir?
So this is so far beyond my my expertise. I can't say anything that would add to the public debate. So let me just not say anything.
So, the Hindenburg as well as Congress party have leveled impropriety allegations against the SEBI chairperson. She and her husband have clarified, but doubts still persist in some people's mind. Do you think enough has been said, enough has been clarified to restore the faith that a regulator should have? And is there a need for an independent probe into all the allegations?
Well, I think that one has to be careful here. Allegations can be made by anybody at any time. But if there is sufficient investigation that has gone into allegations, then it's really important for the regulator to be like Caesar's wife, above suspicion, which means that you have to address the allegations with, this is point by point. If the allegation is of conflicts of interest, this is when the conflicts of interest ceased, this is when the decisions were taken, this is who was in the decision-making room, and therefore the conflict of interest didn't occur, for example. So I think the more detailed the investigation that has gone into the allegations, the more detailed, in a sense, the response has to be point by point, this is why this is not an issue. Ultimately, I think it is important that our regulators be, as credible as possible. And that benefits the nation, it benefits the markets, it benefits, even the regulators themselves.
In your recent interview, you mentioned about you getting threats from business houses who were not very happy with your interest rate hikes that you were doing to control inflation. Can you elaborate what went wrong? What went on during those years and months when you were raising interest rates?
So look, I didn't lose any sleep over it. So you can understand that it wasn't something that I worried much about. In any kind of policy, there will be people who are upset. And those people will, to the extent they think you can succumb, will, either offer you carrots or threaten to, come after you with sticks. And I think that all I was trying to say at that time was, yes, policy making is not like, is not easy all the time. There are people who will try and make you change. But you have to decide what is right. And often, that's all it takes. Nothing proceeds beyond that.
But you have often been trolled for the high interest rate during your regime as the RBI governor and the NPAs that accumulated in the banks. You have clarified enough, but still those doubts linger. Why is that?
So, as my daughter would say, haters will be haters. There's an agenda behind the trolling. And, you can't do anything about that. What you can do is try and explain to people, yes, the RBI sometimes has to raise interest rates to bring down inflation. But what I would also point to is the many years we've had moderate inflation. That has something to do, just like Dr. Rangarajan raised rates in the late 90s. and it gave us a period of low inflation in the early 2000s. Similarly, you look at the inflation record over the last few years, despite ups and downs like COVID, it has been reasonably stable. So, that's the positive of raising interest rates. You create an environment which then is beneficial down the line. It helps, future, in fact, we ourselves cut interest rates significantly. And people sometimes forget, all my rate cuts were in the BJP time I was a governor during the BJP regime. All my rate hikes were during the Congress regime. But still, I am the congressman, according to some. But then there's the NPAs. The problem with NPAs is the time when they're created and the time when they're uncovered can be very different. Many of the NPAs we had were generated in the euphoria before the global financial crisis, when there was a feeling that any kind of investment would work. This was not corruption. This was just the standard euphoria that comes from business people. One business person was telling me how he was being chased by bankers with checkbooks. Bataiye kitne ka check likhun? They were just looking for making loans because the loans had worked out. But that's when the bad loans start happening, and they happened. And then the question was, do you force recognition, which is a good thing because it helps, clean up the bank balance sheet, and then allows, future growth. Or do you extend and pretend and hope that it goes away? It never goes away. But of course, once you start uncovering, the claim is, oh, you created the NPAs. No, I didn't create the NPAs. What we did was we recognized the NPAs, and they were substantial. But now you see the benefit. Banks have much cleaner balance sheets and have the potential to lend.
So is your tenure at RBI, the legacy that you left behind, where the benefits have started accruing now in form of lower interest, lower inflation, as well as clean up of balance sheet? Is that the legacy that you left behind?
I wouldn't say that's my legacy. I would say that's the legacy of the RBI, with successive governors who have done the right thing. And I think that should be respected in the central bank, that it's performed. And I think it's not just NPAs, not just credit, but look at positive things like UPI, which has been just introduced in 2023, something which looks like UPI. And of course, it's still slowly taking off. When I look at UPI and see nearly 10 billion transactions, I say a month, I say this is something very successful. So, there are positive things, but everything is never one person. It's a combination of people working through an institution which has great pride and great strength. So I would congratulate the RBI for all that.
Finally, you were also trolled for your comments on intolerance, growing intolerance in the country. Do you still stand by the comment? Has the intolerance grown wider, or has it come down?
I don't know what a good way of seeing that would be. I think it's extremely important as a country to keep examining your willingness to let the weakest in your society flourish. That means creating some supports for them, but also making sure that the laws bend over backwards, as well as people bend over backwards. That doesn't mean privileging. It does mean that you sort of recognize the stakes are against, disadvantaged people, and you try and eliminate the impediments in their way. And as far as we can do it, it is in the interests of the country, because having everybody grow is positive. We just talked about states growing at different paces, but communities growing at different paces. Now, again, it's important that we take care also of the sense of fairness. It shouldn't be that some communities feel, you're privileging those at my expense. But we have to grow the pie enough that I feel that it's in both our interests. It's in my interest that you grow, and you should not feel that you're being shut down by the stronger community. You should feel the stronger community has your interests at heart. That's the kind of environment that will allow for more social peace, and we need much more of that if we are to become a Viksit Desh. We need social peace. The one thing I've always said that stands in the way of India's development will be our politics. We need to get the politics right.
You just co-authored a book. So what's keeping you busy these days? Another book is coming, or you're looking at politics?
No, I'm actually writing papers that nobody else can read. This is what academics do, right? Write papers that, other academics can read. So I'm actually doing that. So, don't ask me to explain them to you. But Viral Acharya, who is former deputy governor here, he and I are working on a bunch of papers, working on papers with my longtime co-author, Doug Diamond. He just won the Nobel Prize. So I'm getting him back to work, which is, it's so incredibly fun writing papers. So no politics, just writing papers.
So you're saying you're not going to enter politics at all at any point of time?
I am working on academic papers. That's what I'm doing.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan, for speaking to us.